Greetings, dear friends. You are watching the channel of Ruslan Belov, and before you is another daily review of the situation on the Ukrainian front. Events continue to develop with intensity. News has emerged regarding a new assassination attempt. This time, the target was a lieutenant general and the deputy chief of the GRU, Main Intelligence Directorate. I would like to remind you that the head of the GRU is currently leading a negotiating delegation in the United Arab Emirates. It was precisely his deputy who was the target of the murder attempt. According to available information, the assassination attempt failed. The officer survived, the surgical intervention was successful, and as of today, there is no threat to his life or health. It is also reported that the suspected killer has been detained. Significant resources were deployed for his capture, and the operation involved structures from several different states simultaneously. Furthermore, last night, the armed forces of the Russian Federation launched a large-scale strike on Ukraine's energy infrastructure facilities. As a result, a significant portion of the country's western regions was left without electricity. The primary strikes targeted western Ukraine, hitting at least 5 energy facilities. Emergency power outages were introduced in most regions. Separately, a powerful fire is reported at a warehouse belonging to the Roshan company, which broke out following the nighttime attack. For those who may have forgotten, I will remind you. Roshan is a corporation associated with the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, who remains one of the most adamant supporters of continuing the war and regularly speaks out against any concessions. Combat operations along the front line continue, and we are now moving on to a detailed analysis of the current situation. Friends, only yesterday I mentioned that the flow of news from the front might decrease slightly in the near future. This is due to the deterioration of communication amid the outages of the Starlink system. Nevertheless, information continues to arrive in significant volumes. Naturally, such communication problems may temporarily affect the pace of advancement. How seriously this will be felt will become clear toward the end of the month, when we summarize the results for February. At the same time, all talk suggesting that the front has supposedly come to a complete halt, that there is no more advancement, and that a retreat is about to begin, is groundless. Such statements are either deliberate lies or outright hostile propaganda. In reality, the front line has not frozen. Russian units continue to move forward. Over the past 24 hours, advancements have been recorded in several directions at once, including the capture of one settlement. Moreover, this occurred in the Sumy direction. The Grabovskoye bridgehead is not only being maintained but continues to expand. This time, advancement was achieved on a sector approximately 3.5 kilometers wide. The depth of the penetration was approximately 1 kilometer 600 meters, and the total area of the occupied territory exceeded 5 square kilometers. For the Sumy region, this is, without exaggeration, a very high tempo. Additionally, a settlement was taken under control, the border village of Popovka. Thus, the total width of the bridgehead has increased to 11 kilometers, and the number of occupied settlements has reached 3: Grabovskoye, Vysokoye, and Popovka. By the way, when was the last time you heard about advancements by Ukrainian forces in the Sumy region? I recall that back in the summer, Volodymyr Zelensky stated that by October, the region would be completely cleared of Russian units. However, reality has turned out to be the exact opposite. Russian control in the Sumy region is expanding month by month, albeit slowly but steadily. Furthermore, there is information regarding another border village, Pokrovka. This settlement is significantly larger than Popovka. According to incoming data, Russian units have not just entered Pokrovka, but have taken control of the majority of the village. At this moment, only the southwestern sector of the settlement remains under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine, the area up to the farm located further south. Most likely resistance there will be broken in the near future, and another village in the Sumy region will pass under Russian control. Now let us move to other updates from the past 24 hours. The Kharkiv region. Here, battles continue for the village of Chugunovka. Over the last 24 hours, it was possible to advance within the residential areas by approximately 800 meters. The advancement is difficult, and the tempo is not high. However, the clearing of Chugunovka is of fundamental importance. After its capture, a direct road opens to a larger settlement. the village of Olkovatka. Its occupation, in turn, will create conditions for further advancement in the interfluve and for joining with units that are supposed to move toward them from the direction of Vovchansk. So far, this movement has not been observed. The advancement toward Bely Kolodez has not yet begun, although previously the prerequisites for this looked quite obvious after the capture of Vovchansk and Vilcha. The reasons for such a pause remain unclear at this moment. Moving further, an interesting update has arrived from the Alexandrovka direction. A cartographer with the call sign Manul has confirmed previously emerging information that two settlements, Kromovo and Bondanoye, have passed under the control of the Russian army. At the same time, it should be noted that no footage of objective control for either Kromovo or Bondanoye has been received yet. Therefore, we are keeping this information in mind, but we do not officially count it in the statistics until visual confirmation appears. Nonetheless, the coloring of the map most likely reflects the actual state of affairs. Several sources at once reported the capture of these villages, and as is known, such reports rarely arise without foundation. Given the configuration of the armed forces of Ukraine's positions in this area, it was extremely difficult to hold them. Therefore, the probability that Kromovo and Bondanoye are under Russian control is very high. However, as I have already said, we will wait for confirmation, as we focus primarily on objective data. Now, regarding Belytske, I have repeatedly emphasized, both yesterday and in previous episodes, that it is precisely in this sector where positive news should be expected, and it is indeed beginning to arrive. Russian units continue the envelopment of the city. Entry had already been carried out from the eastern direction, and now advancement has occurred further south, reaching the southwestern outskirts of Belytske. In the process, the Svetloye-Belytske road was cut. I also remind you of the information I voiced earlier. The Russian army is also advancing along the road north of the city. As a result, a frontline configuration is forming in which Belytske is already effectively in a semi-encirclement. Given the relatively small size of the city, very little remains until a complete encirclement is achieved. Judging by the general dynamics and incoming data, Belytske is, with a high degree of probability, the next settlement that will be fully taken under control. Today, video materials were also received from Rodinske. From this point, the advancement of Russian assault units along the southern outskirts of the city under fire from the armed forces of Ukraine was recorded. It is reported that the zone of control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in Rodinske is expanding, occupying new positions in the residential sector. The advancement amounted to more than 300 meters. I will remind you that a large part of Rodinske was already under Russian control previously. Furthermore, Russian units continue to expand their zone of control outside the city limits as well. Naturally, the positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation are subjected to strikes by Ukrainian FPV drones. However, it is often these very attacks that record the new points of presence of Russian troops, which is reflected on the map as a further expansion of controlled territory. At the same time, I will note that Rodinske was already previously marked as being under the control of the Russian side. Moving to the Dobropilia salient, changes have also been recorded here. More precisely, confirmation of the expansion of the control zone has been received. However, let us dwell separately on the settlements of Udakne, Molodetskoye, and Kotlino. In the comments, you have repeatedly asked for clarification on what is happening in these sectors after the Starlink disconnection. I do not have the full picture. However, the latest available information is as follows. The armed forces of Ukraine launched strikes on the positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation using FPV drones in the area of Udakne almost daily, primarily north of the settlement. Similar activity by Ukrainian FPV drones is recorded in the area of Kotlino. Furthermore, from the direction of Novopodgorodnoye, the Ukrainian military has repeatedly attempted to send small assault groups to break through into the western part of Udakne. All these attempts were thwarted. The groups were destroyed with the help of Russian FPV drones. As for Molodetskoye, the situation there remains uncertain. Either the settlement is under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, or most likely, it is located in the grey zone. Ukrainian units were moving toward Udakne from both the direction of Novopodgorodnoye and the direction of Molodetskoye, which suggests exactly this status. At the moment, it can be said that Russian units hold Udakne, the positions north of it, and a large part of Kotlino. In the conditions of the Starlink disconnection, the amount of operational news from this direction is certainly decreasing. Therefore, as of today, I have voiced everything that has been successfully clarified recently. In the Huliaipole direction yesterday, late in the evening, materials were received confirming the entry of Russian units into the settlement of Zalizniknoye. Russian sources report the following: forward positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in the residential sector of Zalizniknoye came under fire from the armed forces of Ukraine. At the same time, Russian units advanced approximately 2 kilometers and commenced active combat operations to establish control over the settlement, occupying new positions in its northern part. It was from this point that video materials were obtained, recording the presence of Russian troops directly in Zalizniknoye. I remind you that we previously discussed information regarding the alleged entry of Russian units into the southern part of this settlement. However, at that time, it was never confirmed. Now, a different version is confirmed. Russian troops did indeed enter Zalizniknoye from the direction of the settlement of Starukranka. It was exactly this development of events that we spoke about earlier. At the current moment, after establishing control over Starukranka and Sviatopetrovka, Russian units continue to exert pressure in the direction of the settlement of Gorkoye, which is precisely what they are doing now. Earlier, reports appeared stating that Russian troops had supposedly entered Gorkoye and were delivering strikes against the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine inside the settlement. However, at this moment, no objective confirmation of advancement directly within Gorkoye has been received. Initially, it was assumed that after taking Gorkoye, Russian units would bypass Zalizniknoye. But in the end, the situation developed according to a different scenario. Russian troops entered Zalizniknoye after all and have begun storming it. Furthermore, video materials were obtained today from yet another point. Previously, the forward positions of Russian forces were located here. I will remind you that we spoke about the movement of Russian units along the railway line with the aim of straightening the front line and reaching Zalizniknoye from the southern side. It was from this location that new footage arrived, recording an attack by an infantry unit of the armed forces of the Russian Federation west of the Huliaipole-Dorozhnyanka line. Huliaipole is situated in this area, Dorozhnyanka is located here, and an important supply road passes between them. Active combat operations are currently taking place west of this road. Assault units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation are advancing under enemy fire toward the railway leading to Zalizniknoye. As a result, the zone of control of the Russian forces was expanded to approximately 3.5 kilometers. As of today, the entire territory marked in red on the map has passed under the full control of Russian troops. I will also note that video materials had previously arrived from another point where Russian units first stormed the trench line of a fortified area of the armed forces of Ukraine. Subsequently, Ukrainian forces were able to temporarily push back the Russian units and reclaim these positions. However, at the current moment, there is no precise information regarding the control over this fortified area. It can be assumed with a high degree of probability that it is once again under the control of Russian forces. At this moment, the situation in this sector is developing in exactly this manner. Russian troops continue to deliver strikes on the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in the areas of Vozdvizhivka and Rizdvianka. No confirmed advancements have been recorded in these directions as of today. That is all for the current situation at the front. Now let us look at what is happening in the political arena. The negotiations in Abu Dhabi and all previous iterations of the Russian-Ukrainian dialogue with American mediation look like an anomalous phenomenon from the perspective of classical diplomacy. There is a sense that they are being conducted by both Moscow and Kiev with one goal: not to anger Trump and to try to keep him on their side. Why Ukraine needs this is clear. Without American military aid, the armed forces of Ukraine simply will not be able to continue combat operations. Why Moscow is agreeing to this is inexplicable from the standpoint of rational logic. Of course, if the United States were to suspend the delivery of weapons and intelligence data for Ukrainian needs for the duration of the mediation efforts, the situation would be fundamentally different. but they are arriving in a wide stream, and against this background, Moscow recognizes Washington as a neutral mediator rather than a biased ally of Ukraine. This is some kind of new word in world politics. The most interesting part is that the benefit of such a Russian approach is exactly zero. If anyone believes that the United States can be removed from the Ukrainian equation in this manner, it is an expression of extreme naivety. Why would they exit such a successful project of war against Russia by proxy? If the Russian side has plans to agree to a compromise peace in exchange for the lifting of sanctions and broad prospects for Russian-American economic cooperation, that will not happen either. Why would Washington strengthen Russia? The Trump administration is behaving in an extremely pragmatic manner. Its goal is to preserve Ukraine, which has lost the war, in the form of a combat unit for future conflicts with Russia. To this end, it has entered into negotiations with Moscow and is painting broad prospects for it. The best strategy for the Russian side would be the swiftest possible elimination of the Ukrainian political regime, using the entire spectrum of available weapons and moving toward negotiations on a new architecture for European security. So far, the only results of the negotiations in Abu Dhabi have been agreements between Russia and Ukraine regarding the exchange of prisoners of war, as well as hints at the restoration of dialogue through military channels between Moscow and Washington. There are also talks about possible negotiations regarding the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START, which expires exactly today. Strictly speaking, that is all. On the other hand, what else could have been expected from military technical consultations? On major political issues, however, only inconsistencies are observed so far. Ukraine does not want to cede territories, and it prefers the troops of NATO countries as security guarantees. And this is even before the sides have begun discussing the Russian language and church issues. Therefore, what is happening in Abu Dhabi is merely a channel of communication and nothing more. Of course, everything taking place in the United Arab Emirates could grow into a serious dialogue, but for that, a strategic result on the ground is required. For now, the armed forces of Ukraine are holding on, and furthermore, according to Zelensky, they are counting on the exhaustion of Russia. Thus, nothing will end either this winter or even in the spring. However, if Moscow continues to take the infrastructure war seriously, as it has been doing in the last few months, then the collapse of Ukraine's military machine will occur in the not-so-distant future. Nevertheless, for this to happen, a firm political decision is necessary to go to the very end in the destruction of Ukrainian energy and transport infrastructure. Does such a decision exist? We will find out soon.